Groundhog Day. I'm not the first person to draw the comparison of Groundhog Day and Catholic theology. Far from. So I won't claim for this to be an original observation, but let's take a deeper look at it anyway.
For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Bear with me because I am suffering from just a slight, mild cold. For the record, I do want to state that I have not looked up any other analysis from a Catholic perspective. This is because I didn't want anyone else to influence my own ideas, my own philosophy, if you will. So if there's any likeness or similarities to other analyses out there, trust me when I say this, I promise you it is purely coincidental. But hey, it is likely. There's a lot of Catholics out there, a lot of Catholics that have seen this movie, and we all saw the same movie, and we all come from the same background, so we're most likely gonna say very similar things. You're watching Dimphna's Devotion, and I'm Luke. What's this? I'm doing movie reviews now? Not really. Sort of a deep dive analysis. What I think of the film's quality is not going to be quite the same as pursuing the meaning of the movie itself. I understand that Groundhog Day wasn't intentionally written as a Christian movie or a take on Catholic theology. Director Harold Ramis has gone on record to admit the script was completed before it reached him, and revisions were made to make the movie more entertaining.
And it's the genius of Danny Rubin's concept. The script came to me already written. Again, kind of not really makeable the way it was written, but I rewrote it and shared screenplay credit with Danny. I had some fundamental ideas about it that I think made it a more entertaining and more accessible film than it might have been the way it was originally written. One thing Danny did in his original script was start it in the middle. One of the first things we told Danny when we met, we said, we love that it starts in the middle. One thing we don't want to, drop that. We're gonna keep that. It's very hip. It's very cool that you started right, with the thing already happening.
I'm curious to see how it would have turned out as a less entertaining movie, but honestly, I'm happy with the end result that we have today. This is one of my favorite romantic comedies of all time. Allegedly, this was also the movie that led to a split between Harold Ramis and Bill Murray, which is probably why you didn't see them working together much after. In fairness, the whole message of this movie, premise aside, is parallel to Scrooged, another Bill Murray movie that released just a few years prior. Arrogant, egotistical jerk at the beginning of the movie finds redemption, peace, and reforms by the end, and positively impacts the lives of those around him. Harold Ramis claimed he had heard from Catholic leaders, Protestants, Buddhists, and even yoga practitioners praising the relatable message, but Ramis was actually Jewish.
It's a metaphor for a lot of things. They thought it expresses a fundamental Buddhist concept. And then I started getting letters from the Christian, from Catholic priests and Christian and Baptist ministers saying this totally expresses our philosophy. You must be Christians, obviously, because it's such a devoutly Christian movie. As a Jew, I kept thinking that people finding so much in this movie. He said, I just have to tell you, I watched Groundhog Day again just the other night, and I saw whole new things in it.
In one of his interviews, he mentioned he regularly read Torah, but I don't know a great deal about Jewish faith. This video was sort of a research as I wrote the script kind of deal, but we can put that little tidbit of information to the side for now and return to it when it's more advantageous.
My analysis my view of that was the Torah is read every year. Start at the same place on the same day. Every Jew in the world reads the same portion every day for the whole cycle, and then you start over. The Torah doesn't change, but every year we read it, we are different. Our lives have changed. We're older. We're different. We have children. We don't. Our relationships have changed. And you find new meaning in it as we change. There's something in it that allows people to keep, every time they see it, reconsider where they are in life and kind of question their own habitual behaviors.
All Ramis and his coworker were trying to accomplish with this film was a metaphor of how you can escape the trap of a repetitive lifestyle as a seemingly irredeemable miser and change the course of the rest of your life by finding inner peace and turning the tide of who you really are. So Ramus admits the essence of purgation is there, but he wasn't looking through the Catholic lens. Perhaps any religion can find some sort of relatability in Groundhog Day, which is what makes it so special. Like looking at a painting and you see something personal in that painting that the other guy next to you in the art museum doesn't see, but he sees his own translation, even though you're both looking at the same painting. That's how movies are supposed to work. But you know what? I'm Catholic, so let's find the Catholic-friendly parts in this movie. One thing I think we made clear is that this is a purification movie, which aligns with February 2nd, the feast day of the purification of Our Lady. Now, that's a completely different thing. The Blessed Virgin Mary did not ever have a single stain of sin on her soul, so she's not comparable to Phil Connors by any means. The purification of Our Lady refers to the ritual purification Mary underwent according to Jewish law after having given birth, marking the end of her ritual impurity and the official end of the Catholic Christmas season. That's something I teased with in my last video of 2024. But purification in the English syntax mainly implies a cleansing of filth, and that's what's really happening here in Groundhog Day. To enter heaven, you must be pure. You must be as perfect as the Virgin Mary. Nothing impure or unclean can stand before God, which is why we have this gift from God known as purgatory. Sorry, Protestants. It is real. It's even in Scripture more than once. You should really look it up sometime because purgatory literally hurts like hell. They use the same furnace. Well, you don't have to believe me. It's on you to find out for yourself. We'll get back to you in another video, Purgatory Book. Soon. Back to the movie. Groundhog Day is a movie about redemption found through suffering in a supernatural event. Phil is in a limbo-type state, looping the same day repeatedly until he is met with his innermost desires that conflict with his personal flaws. Phil undergoes a purification ritual in a purgatory-light state by suffering this temporal anomaly until he pursues greater character growth. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba, anomaly, ba-ba-da-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba, anomaly, ba-ba-da-ba. Ba-da-da-ba-da-da-ba-da. For Scrooge, the whole premise was already prepared for the screenwriters by Charles Dickens. The writers just had to add a modern twist on it for the modern audience of 1989. And the Ghostbusters audience, of course. It was almost like plagiarism while totally owning up to being plagiarism. And it worked, too. It's one of my favorite Bill Murray movies. He was at his best between 84 and 93, with few exceptions. Ghostbusters 2 not being one of them. In Scrooge, a form of time travel is used to deliver an illumination of conscience, which is supposed to be a supernatural event that everyone goes through while receiving their judgment. The illumination of conscience is used also through time manipulation means, except we don't know who's doing the manipulating and we never find out. Maybe it's Rita? It's also interesting to note that at first, he seems to possess the power to accept the time loop to last for eternity. While drinking with the guys that made fun of him for having the same name as a groundhog, he laments that he wishes there was another day he was living over and over. The day in question was a fling that he had when he was at the Virgin Islands, where he had intercourse with a woman he had just met.
I was in the Virgin Islands once. I met a girl. We ate lobster, drank pina coladas. At sunset, we made love like sea otters. That was a pretty good day. Why couldn't I get that day over and over?
Fast forward a little, and Phil finds an attractive woman in the cafe after devouring the entire pastry side of the menu, obtains necessary information from her to seduce her on the next round, the next loop.
Phil.
Oh, Rita.
Who's Rita?
Phil discovered the formula to achieve what he was lamenting at the bowling alley, but he doesn't pursue it every loop. There's even a scene where he meets a completely different woman that he convinces into dressing up to go see a movie with. Perhaps boosted by his local celebrity status, Phil possessed the means necessary to sleep around, if that was what truly made him happy. It's immediately discovered that none of the flings and one-night stands were making him happy. That's not restricted to Phil, That's the case for all men. Phil saying Rita's name while getting hot and heavy with Nancy could have been seen as the first clue that he was interested in his producer. All of us who have seen the movie hundreds of times know it's not the first clue. It's not even the second clue either, or the third. Let's go over those together. Phil starts the movie as an absolute miser because he's already a prisoner before the movie begins. He's a prisoner to his pride, even though he does love what he does, just not who he's doing it for.
I'm probably leaving TBH.
Phil is already unhappy going into the temporal loop, so he's living Groundhog Day before Groundhog Day can even begin. The lingering look that Phil gives Rita while she's playing in front of the blue screen indicates that he's charmed by her right off the bat. Rita is immediately introduced as the ticket to Bill's escape, but Phil isn't convinced that he's worthy of happiness. Well, he wants happiness at a certain layer, but in all the wrong ways, like everyone else in the real world.
Gosh, you're an upbeat lady.
There are layers to every single human being. We're all like ogres and onions. There's lots of layers to you and me. There are external layers, which we are convinced we would be a lot happier by achieving the worldly goals like financial success, celebrity status, being with a lot of women, and the list goes on. What the movie seems to address here is that none of those things really matter, and attempts to peel back those layers, telling us that these things are the temporary means to happiness. The greater pursuit to happiness is even deeper. Oftentimes, it can be best reached by supernatural means, which is why miracles happen sometimes. Emphasis on the supernatural for Phil Connors, as that's definitely what it takes for him to peel back those layers. Supernatural on a grand scale. The second clue we get is a little conversation Phil and Rita have, where Larry, the cameraman, is more of a fly on the wall for. Phil is roasting Rita a little, but she laughs in response, whereas everyone else prior has shown a less pleasing reaction to Phil and his humor. Phil immediately appears to be caught off guard by this response, and the only way he knows how to deal with it is through furthering his humor. His offering of the blood sausages he previously mentioned and discussed is delivered in a softer and more of a wink wink nudge nudge kind of way.
Would you like some blood sausage? I have some here in the glove
I
compartment.
like blood sausage.
The third clue we get is a little more subtle than the first two, but is delivered mostly in his body language with how he responds to Rita booking him with a quaint bed and breakfast. Of course, there's a line he delivers with his usual dry sarcasm, but it's coming from that more external and worldly layer that we explored earlier.
Keep the talent happy.
Anything I can do?
Would you help me with my pelvic tilt?
Within reason.
Phil is too distracted by his own personal worldly interests to be able to see the beautiful opportunity he has to make the absolute most out of the world around him. But he is incapable of seeing that without furthering his suffering. It is through suffering that we really find ourselves. Through the purifying flames and the trials, we must be found. Not wanting. After all, a diamond cannot be formed without the pressures of the earth. Or Superman.
See us fly out of the sky. I was lying in my head. Is it super? We're only two meters in fly.
Oh, you want quotes from actual canonized saints. Okay, let's use this from Saint Therese of Lisieux. Suffering is the very best gift he, Jesus, has given us. He gives it only to his chosen friends. And of course, we have to choose him, technically. We'll get into that later. I should make a whole separate video on this one day. But every single beatified and canonized saint has gone through a terrible trial on earth that led to heaven granting them their reward and saying, let this person serve as a model who has paved the way for the rest of you. Especially those saints that were used by God as victim souls for a greater good, like St. John Vianney, St. Gemma Galgani, St. Padre Pio, all the saints who received stigmata, or even those that suffered more mental anguish, like my Saint Dymphna, stood like a house built on a rock, not like a house built on sand. When Phil eventually gives in to seeing Rita as someone of interest, he's still battling that more external layer that just wants to satisfy the urge for temporary lustful satisfaction. Therefore, even when he has found the formula to seduce the girl by the middle of the story, it's still not enough. More purifying needs to be done. Phil saying Rita's name while getting passionate with Nancy was the confirmation the audience needed that Phil was more interested in Rita. As far as we know, after that point, Phil no longer pursues Nancy despite possessing the necessary means to do so. Nancy is a smaller trophy for Phil, not the ultimate prize, but the ultimate prize is not so easily won over. That's what makes the ultimate prize more worth it. Remember that. Tinder ladies that are just looking for short-term fun and using bikini pics in your profile, you are not the ultimate catch you think you are. The ultimate catch doesn't dwell on being the ultimate catch. The most humble person in the world doesn't think he is humble at all, but rather is more focused on how he can be better repentant of his sins. Now you know why I swipe left on bikini pictures, but let's save some of that for the Valentine's Day video. Phil is battling what basically most men, if not all men, battle. Phil is confronted with the physical desires that have led him astray for too long, to the point where he realizes satisfying those will only keep him imprisoned in a materialistic reality. Phil's consistent failures with Rita serve his examination of conscience. The suicide montage parallels the message that Phil dies every day the longer he remains trapped in his own internal prison. So really, Phil is in two prisons throughout this movie. The prison of himself and the temporal loop. Phil doesn't necessarily see Rita as the ticket to his freedom, at least not initially, but sees her as more of a means to a temporary end. Rita is fortunately smart enough to see right through that, and she knows her value. Rita knows she's better than just a one-night stand kind of girl. Praise be to Jesus for this ultimate love interest. Rita is the model character that every woman seeking happiness should fashion themselves after. In secular media form, no less. After suffering literal death repeatedly, Phil comes to accept that there just may be no way out. At least there's no way out without change. This movie is also a media interpretation of Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. What does Phil have to do to obtain a different result? Changing his entire mindset and making it habitual. Even simply doing good is not enough. He can no longer fuel his selfish side by committing crimes and hooking up with sleazy women. The groundhog seeing its shadow every time he's pulled out of the tree stump is not what's keeping him trapped in the time loop. The key to Phil's freedom is Rita, who just so happens to be Catholic. This is confirmed by Rita, who reveals having attended 12 years of Catholic school from first grade to senior year.
You're not a god. You can take my word for it. This is 12 years of Catholic school talking.
I know a lot of Catholics don't come out of private Catholic schools still being Catholic, so whatever Catholic school Rita went to must have been traditional and treated the Eucharist with the proper reverence that it's worthy of. Phil is finally granted a night with Rita that is not fueled by the urge to satisfy a lustful desire. They don't even kiss this time. They are completely platonic in their interactions, and that's when Phil goes from his illumination of conscience to his examination of conscience. Phil finally manages to peel back that layer he was truly imprisoned by before the imprisonment of the temporal loop. Phil overcomes himself at last once he realizes what is more rewarding. It's still not enough. Phil must change. Phil has learned to deny himself, but the world still wants more from Phil. The world wants Phil to be his absolute best and to stay his absolute best. We see Phil continuing the time loop, being a kinder version of himself, so kindness alone doesn't cut it. Phil has broken down the wall of despair and takes advantage of the loop by picking up new hobbies. The ice sculpture hobby is teased earlier in the movie and receives its payoff when Phil pursues the best possible version of himself. Phil uses the temporal anomaly to sharpen his skills that he otherwise would have left untapped. Rita confesses that she likes a man who plays an instrument, and Phil finds himself inspired to tickle the ivories, if you will. He certainly spares no expense in learning to do so.
Kind of want to get started. I could give you $1,000.
Phil goes from being a prisoner of this world to being the master of this world. Phil stops living his life for himself and starts living in the service for others by becoming a local Superman. He's even blessed with the grace to accept the things that he cannot change with his repeated repeated failures to save the old homeless man. But it only fuels his desire to change the things that he can impact. Phil finds a greater reward in this new character he unlocked by peeling back the old layers, even if he's still stuck in the temporal loop. Phil remains in the flames until he is found not wanting. The old ways are being washed away as the temporal loop gives him the opportunity to incorporate his new character as a proper habit. The movie suggests that getting the girl in the end wasn't the true reward. The true reward was Phil mastering his self-denial of his old ways. Don't get me wrong, the movie seems to prove that ending up with Rita was the ticket to his freedom, but achieving the ticket to freedom required great effort. Another quote from St. Therese, "You cannot be half a saint, you must be a whole saint or no saint at all." Phil even finds himself doing the smallest acts of virtue with great love by the third act, following the philosophical wisdom of St. Therese of Lisieux yet again. The movie even suggests that Phil found the means necessary to seduce Rita into intercourse, but he doesn't. They never engage in sexual relations at all throughout the entire story. Phil even transcends Rita's level. This indicates what all women should be seeking. A man that even given the opportunity to take advantage of you still doesn't, and still points you to a higher purpose. That higher purpose being the one true God. This is indicated when Phil first wakes up fully clothed from the night before and confronted by Rita herself, asking why Phil wasn't so kissy-kissy the night before. Instead, he just fell asleep.
Bill, why weren't you like this last night? You just fell asleep.
After all, pulling an all-nighter getting to know a woman intellectually is much more rewarding than cheap physical pleasure. You should know by now, I'm not being sarcastic. This movie does not promote intercourse outside of wedlock. Quite the contrary, this movie highlights why satisfying lustful desires isn't the end-all be-all satisfaction. Also, not once is the name of Jesus used in vain. I've seen this movie many times. I'm very sensitive to hearing the name of my Lord and Savior used in vain. So whereas this isn't intended to be a Christian movie, it is Christian-friendly. More so than many PG-rated movies that came before it and after. Harold Ramis may not have been fully familiar with the Catholic take on purgatory, but he admits this was meant to reflect the similarities of purgatory in order for the main character to achieve redemption. Redemption stories are always the best kinds of stories. So while this wasn't intended to be a Catholic movie, it is one of the best non-Catholic movies. Let's make secular media more like Groundhog Day. Speaking of purgatory, it has been revealed by mystics such as Maria Valtorta that Jews and Muslims may find themselves in purgatory if God sees greater holiness in their hearts. So regardless of Harold Ramis being Jewish when he was alive, and regardless of his passing in 2014, we can still pray for his soul. That's a wrap on this video. God bless you all, and I'll see you next time in whatever I do next. Bye.